Greetings, you admirable and damnable accursed. I'm David Herle, as I always tend to be. He's Scott Reid, when he damn well feels like it. And before I introduce today's guest panelist, I just want to do a wee tease for our sister podcast, The Herle Burley, because it's the 5-year anniversary of that program. Yep, you've been putting up with my questions, challenges, probes, POVs, and shockingly aggressive laughter for 5 goddamn years. And I thank you from the bottom of my Hawkins cheesy encrusted heart. So we're going back to our roots. This Thursday afternoon, we're recording with our maiden guest, David Axelrod, host of the Axe Files, has graciously agreed to join us again. And we're very excited about that. Tune in this week for the Herle Burley. All right, let's get to today's curse. Andrew MacDougall is in the third chair. Andrew's another friend of Air Quotes Media, having appeared on the Herle Burley just over 2 years ago. He's the former Director of Communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Now living in London, he's a director at Trafalgar Strategy and writes about politics and current affairs in all the places you want to read about politics and current affairs. Here's what we're talking about today. What everybody else is talking about. The accosting of Chrystia Freeland in Alberta. Into that conversation, we'll break down government's response, opposition response, particularly Pierre Poilievre's response. And is there any kind of media bias at play here in the way this issue is being treated versus, say, the anti-Semitic tweets of a government contractor? Quebec's election's underway. We'll get to that if we have time, but the first one is a big topic. Our cursed clipping is Andrew's excellent piece in the Ottawa Citizen on Poilievre using his opponent's hysteria to fuel his growing popularity, and Gordon Pinsent will bring us home with our Hey Yous. Andrew, Scott, how are you guys?
Doing well. Thank you for having me on again.
Andrew, where do we find you?
Where do you find me? You find me in the middle of London, England, land of Brexit and struggling economy and rampant inflation and many buckets of shit that I get to deal with every day.
Is there any other issue in England besides gas prices? What I've read just sounds inconceivable.
Yeah, no, it is. It is worse than you could imagine, and it's going to be even worse in the winter. The cost for businesses, small businesses in particular. There's a story about a bakery whose gas prices went from £12,000 a year to £54,000. And you run a small business, you don't have those kind of margins. We're looking at hundreds of thousands of people that are going to be out of work this winter. We're looking at an NHS that is creaking already and will be in worse shape in the winter. We have very little economic growth, and we have a political leadership that is focused on being a Margaret Thatcher tribute band and not really grasping the fact that Britain is in a pretty dire place and needs some pretty aggressive policy to get out of it.
Do people attribute those failures? I mean, here in Canada, you have this argument about how much of it is global versus how much of it is a product of domestic policy, or is domestic policy at least amplifying and worsening a global phenomenon? But it seems to me in Britain, that debate is particularly germane, given how much worse it is and given how compounded it feels like everything is by Brexit. Is that a fair analysis, or am I being unfair? And are people there politically going, no, that this is the government's fault. They've made a bad thing terrible.
Yeah, I think, Scott, it is the correct analysis, but the government here and successive conservative governments from Theresa May to Boris Johnson to now looks like Liz Truss have been fortunate in a way that the disaster that is Brexit has been masked by two things. First, a global pandemic that made everything awful, and it made it very hard to delineate what was what and what was to blame for what dent in the economy. And now we have Putin's adventurism in Ukraine and the knock-on effects there. So it's never been crystal clear that this is Brexit alone. Everybody with a brain knows that Brexit has put one arm behind our back. And the debate here is still very much the 2016 version of it, which is you were either in or you're out. And if you were one, you're a traitor. If you're the other, depending on what side you're on. And it's not very sophisticated. And I think the smart people do look at what they've done and have some regret. And whether that's just because the world got to be a very different place than they thought they would be in a post-Brexit world. They thought they'd have more room for opportunity. And now they've been dealing with a pandemic and war. But there's no denying the underlying figures here. It is bad. And nobody seems to be really putting their minds to how to make it better.
Well, you said the smart people. That wouldn't include the incoming prime minister, because she looks like a dummy.
Well, now, she is My business partners worked for David Cameron when she was a minister and didn't have a lot of good things to say. Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's former chief advisor, who's now turned into kind of a rogue internet troll, calls her the human hand grenade because she just goes in and blows things up. And that's not really the kind of temperament that I think I want, because we are on eggshells here. And if you look at the policies they're putting forward, inflation's tipped to be about 18% here come December. Some people think it's already that high. If you really think that kind of massive tax cuts that are all meant to kind of go get us to go out there and spend is going to help that when the labor supply is choked. I mean, I'm no economist, but I know that much that's putting fuel on the fire. And it's the poorest households that are, if my energy bill at home triples, I can cope with that because I'm very fortunate that our household is very stable, but most people can't. And I think, and this is the thing that's the same in Canada, I think as well, is that the political class doesn't live in the same world that a lot of the people they govern live in. And I think too many people in the political class make the assumption that other lives are like their lives, and they're a bit blind to what's going on. And I think that's certainly the case here. And now, as with every leadership race, whether it's for a nomination in the States or Pierre Poilievre or Truss versus Sunak, you're playing to such a small constituency in these things, telling them the things you want them to hear. Like, why did Liz Truss have to haul off and hint that Emmanuel Macron might not be a friend of the UK? Like, are you kidding? In this world of shit, when we're all trying to hang together to fight Vladimir Putin, and you're going to just toss that off as an offhand comment because the 60 people in the room will get excited about it and maybe vote for you? That's not leadership. And it's sad to see. And hopefully there's some great pivot, but nobody's holding their breath.
All right. Speaking of pivots, let's pivot to Canadian politics. And that's a good enough segue into what we're going to talk about as any. Scott, I'm going to let you start off here.
Great.
So this weekend in Grand Prairie, Chrystia Freeland's minding her own business on her way to a meeting, walks through the city hall, is accosted as she boards the elevator by some very large man, big beard, looks like the man from Snowy River, walks toward her physically aggressively, and uses words that don't even pass the curse of politics smell test as appropriate words to use in any kind of company. And there's been quite a reaction across the country about this. Are you surprised by the reaction? What do you think of that event, of the significance of that event?
Well, I think the significance of the event is a really important question to ask, because it implied in the question is, what will come next? What consequences will flow? What might change? So, I mean, there's some practical things. Might they start to review whether or not, and I saw Marco Mendicino out talking about this yesterday, might they review whether or not ministers in this toxic, intensified political world in which we live, do they need security, or at least need an option where they can call upon security if there's some sort of assessment that suggests that there could be a threat? That's not currently available to ministers. I mean, it just didn't. If there was some,
it's always been one of the great things about the country, Scott. I think you and I have talked about this over the years, Andrew. Ministers can just go around the country, no security, and it was never an issue.
That's right, and I like that. And I, in the same way that I kind of lamented in the late 80s when they started putting up security in Parliament Hill, and you couldn't go in under the Peace Tower, and the entrances changed and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, maybe that's just a sign of the times. Maybe if we're going to live in a world of social media where people can congregate in numbers of thousands and say, let's fucking burn down the city of Ottawa, and no one seems to think that that's out of hand. Maybe that's where we're going to end up. So there's some of those practical consequences. What's going to flow out of it? There's going to be a discussion about, what's the line between free speech and what's the line between hate speech? What's the line between free speech? What's the line between something that's threatening and on the borderline of violent? This guy seemed violent. I mean, when you looked into the eyes, we've all been staffers. When you looked in the eyes of those, let's say 25-year-old, 27-year-old women who were standing there with her, and they were a fraction of the size of this guy, you could tell they were thinking to themselves, first of all, they're saying to themselves, as you would think, don't make eye contact. Don't make eye contact, right? Because when you make eye contact with the bear, it might charge, right? But don't make eye contact. You can tell they're also thinking to themselves, what what if this fucking gets out of hand? What are we going to do? Like, how do we, like, you can literally see in their eyes, they're saying, if this fucking guy charges in here, we're euchred, right? Like, we weigh 125
Please close elevator
pounds.
door. Please close.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, it is alarming, and people will, and already there is a pushback. I've been doing radio all week. I'll be doing 1010 all week here in Toronto. And immediately, talking about this yesterday, people are like, there's always been this kind of thing. Quit your pearl clutching. People are allowed to express their point of view. Maybe if the government wasn't filled with such assholes, maybe if she wasn't so goddamn terrible, people wouldn't, it's just like justifying this behavior. And so, what's the significance of it? I'm rambling, I'm sorry, but I think the significance of it is this. I think that there's two contradictory implications. One is, I hope that it triggers a discussion when we say, we're going to have to talk about the responsibilities that individual people, leaders, institutions have here. And I really think that people hate this conversation. They get angry and accusatory about it. But I think that when you've got this kind of anger populism, grievance politics, then it forces politicians, doesn't force politicians, it encourages politicians. The world works by incentives. So if I see an intense and animated base of people who, if I tell them what they want to hear, if I tell them that their anger is justified, if I valorize their anger and say, you're fucking right to be angry, right, then I can get their support. And I can dissociate myself from the most violent and extreme manifestations of that. But I'm going to be pretty careful because I'm actually fishing in that pond. So let's talk about the responsibilities that the Pierre Poilievres and Leslie.
Wait. No, let's not get right there to that. Okay, I want to get to Poilievre in a second.
I understand, but I'm going to say, I think we're going to have to reflect on what the responsibilities are in this, right? If you're going to fish in that pond, what are your responsibilities in terms of, netting the good and the bad of that sort of anger politics? I think the other implication, it seems contradictory. I think the government's got to be careful. I think that it wants to call this out. I think that it needs to talk, it needs to take part in this conversation. But I think it's got to be very careful that people don't say, and people are going to hate this too. People don't go, oh, wait a second, you spent a week talking about this as opposed to talking about bread and butter economic issues. And how do they balance that? And I think that that's going to be a challenge for the government, because if it sounds like their sole focus is this, then it'll just switch back to, this goddamn prime minister and this goddamn government are all about virtue signaling. They're all about, this pocket of issues and inclusion and diversity. And sure, I think that's great, but what about my goddamn wallet? And so I think they're going to have to find a balance. They can't focus on this issue exclusively, and there are dangers of going too hard on this issue. It's a real tricky needle to thread.
Andrew, I want to hear your point of view about all that, but I also want to throw this into the mix for you. Is this genuinely new or worse, or does everybody just have video now, or is it a female phenomenon? And do we have more prominent female politicians now, and that some of this is reacting differently to women in power than they reacted to men in power? What is, just take all that and run with it?
Yeah, I think it's the question of the day. I think, I'm tempted to say it's always been this way, but there's a degree in this. And I think the visibility is a big part of it. We see a lot more, we hear a lot more. There's always that angry guy in the bar who sit at the end of the bar and rail about absolutely everything under the sun, and I'm sure Pierre Trudeau could give you stories if he were still alive from when he went out west or when he was in Quebec in the early 70s. People get angry about things when things are at stake. Passions flare up and people get angry about it. And I think they express that anger. I think the question that politicians and people in the media need to look at is, are we talking about the symptoms or are we talking about the disease? And I think, per your earlier point, a lot of politics now is on that margins of talking about the symptoms. How are people feeling? How are they acting out about that feeling? Is it dangerous? Is it proper, or should it be somewhere else? Whereas we're not focusing the discussion on why so much people are angry or why they feel at threat. And I think the incentive in communication and social media and our media environment now is to keep volleying the ball back and forth about impugning motives or talking about those symptoms, and not doing the really hard work of climbing under the hood and figuring out, well, what's the real issue here? What are we concerned about? Are people feeling there's no hope, no future? Their skill sets and points of view aren't respected in the country. They don't have a role for themselves in this country. And I think I'd like us to talk more about that. And I think that's not where things are going to go, and that's sad. And to the point about, is this a female phenomenon? I think that definitely helps sharpen our minds on this. I had the same reaction as Scott watching that clip, and I thought, maybe because I was a staffer, what that must have felt like to see this guy coming in there. And we're lucky as men to be. I don't put my key between my fingers and my fist when I walk home from the train station here in London at night. But my better half does, and has a spray and a whistle just in case something happens. I don't have to worry about that. And I think we should be mindful of it's a different dynamic. And if we want people, smart people, to come into this political world to try to solve these problems, the last thing they need to worry about is some hothead doing them harm. And to get back to, has it always been that way? I'm sure. But the comment boards are now coming to life. And to Scott's point, what happens next? Here in the UK, we had an MP killed in his constituency not long ago. We had one just before the Brexit referendum. These things can spill over. And I think that's where the political conversation will really shift, is if, heaven forbid, something like that were to happen in Canada. And again, I think we go back to yelling about the symptoms and not the disease. So maybe it wouldn't be helpful. But I think everybody needs to chill out and realize that there are real people on the end of your comments, whether they're delivered via Twitter or whether they're delivered face to face. And if there's anything heartening, gentlemen, to come out of this, I think it's this ability to see it happen in real life still provokes a bit of shock in us. It's like watching a movie where you see people kick the shit out of each other and it doesn't impact you. But if you're down on out at the bar on a Friday night, you see the same thing in real life. It really hits your guts in a different way. So I'm heartened that we had that reaction to this. And I just hope we can have the right conversation now coming out of it about not the kind of tactics and process of politics, but what's going on in our country that makes people feel this way. And that's not to duck the discussion about, is this right? Should this be happening? What should political leaders do? But just to make sure that we don't also forget the real issue, I think.
David, I think your question is really important, and I want to, because I find myself, so much of this is embroidered with the word anger, but I find myself getting angry when people do respond and say, well, this is nothing new. And this is just, and we're just seeing it. It's more visible now because of social media. I think it's desperately wrong. I think there's three things that are distinguishing about the times that we are in. Yes, there's always been cranks, and yes, there's always been anger. And yes, people have actually mobilized that anger politically in the past in varying degrees of success in various jurisdictions. But three things that are different, it seems to me. One, I don't think we can underestimate the power of social media to allow people to congregate, to communicate with one another, to organize and to mobilize. That instrument. I mean, you'd have to meet behind a hall, the Oddfellows Hall or something. And it was hard to get people to get together on Tuesday night so that we can have a hate meeting. It happened, right? But it's a lot easier online, right? And so, that isn't just the drink. That's a straw that stirs the drink. The second thing I think is that you were seeing in a world where participation in politics is diminishing, you see that politicians are desperate for congregations of voters that they can then mobilize, that are already inclined to be mobilized. And so that draws leaders, not just marginal leaders, but mainstream leaders towards these groups, and they start sort of preying on that anger and saying, let's leverage it, perhaps without some of the past impulses to say, well, we got to be careful of how hard we push this stuff. And then the third thing I do think is that we live in a more diverse world. And so you get women, you get people of color, and then that triggers all that whole other dynamic where there's a sense of cracking ice and loss of privilege and position that a bunch of white dudes have, right? And so you put all of those things together, and I think it makes it demonstrably worse than it's been before. And I think probably more active and more dangerous.
As promised, we're back in South Korea this week. David Herle here, your tour guide. Please keep your arms and hands inside the imaginary vehicle. Headsets are available, but you're probably already wearing earbuds, so never mind. A reminder that this tour is being brought to you by our presenting sponsor, TELUS. And South Korea is just our first stop of a number of international best practices. Countries who are making evidence-based policy decisions around how they manage their spectrum. a direct precursor to why their innovation economies are thriving the way they are. But how and why did they get there? In the case of South Korea, the root of it is this: key government involvement at the earliest stages and strategic clarity that 5G was going to play a pivotal role in the fourth industrial revolution. The government's transparent, proactive, and long-term focused spectrum planning is what made their early 5G adoption rate possible. Remember what I told you last week: 5G coverage of 98% of the population, according to PwC. South Korea recognized in the early 2010s that making additional spectrum available quickly and efficiently was a crucial lever to accelerate 5G. It laid out its vision for how to do that in a national spectrum roadmap in 2012, and furthered that vision with a comprehensive spectrum plan published in 2017. This comprehensive plan for connecting the country meant South Korea prioritized getting spectrum to use fast. Major policy goals were transparently defined for everyone to see: global business expansion, increased exports, new jobs, and the creation of a safe user environment. And what happens when you take a hard look at the evidence to accelerate 5G adoption? You become a world leader in the innovation economy. TELUS believes there's no reason why Canada can't do the same. And if we can get it right, that's going to have a massive impact on how we live, access better healthcare, fight climate change, and economically prosper. Hurly-burlyites, stay with me next week as we dive deeper into rural and remote spectrum deployment and see how our policies stack up with a number of our G7 cousins. Do you think politicians are stoking this, Andrew? And if so, what the hell are we going to do about that? It's not like we're going to have some sort of meeting of all politicians and get them to agree to Marquess of Queensberry rules for politics.
Yeah, no, they're not. And again, my mind always drifts back. I hear everything Scott just said, but I think ultimately what makes us less tense and less confrontational is a feeling that there is a better future out there for us. And I think there's a lot of anxiety because we've had kind of 40 years of one-way thinking on how an economy should work and who should benefit from that economy and global capital flows and all that stuff. And I think then you add Scott's diversity point about immigration, the changing look and feel of a country. And these aren't conversations that you can duck or that you, and I think we've tended to do that in Western democracies. We try to just reassure people, oh, it's fine. Oh, it's all good. Oh, there won't be a problem. Oh, we'll do better as a whole, while we've ignored some pretty serious and deep pockets of people that haven't. So I think what we're seeing now is a lot of festering that is now bubbling up with the help of technology, but also we're just, we're on 12, 14 years on from the financial crisis. We've just been through a pandemic. The world has changed. People feel insecure. You can't make a decent living with your hands on a single income family, hope to own your house and a car. It's a different world. And I don't think politics has gotten very good at addressing the public policy problem. So I think there's a fertile ground for it. I think politicians do fish for it. Just like in the late 70s here, Thatcher fished against the unions and anger at the unions to push her reforms, her neoliberal, free market monetarism. And I think, we had the third way after that, which was more consensual and trying to consolidate those gains while adding to the social benefit side. And now we're at a point where somebody's going to have to come up with the next big idea to address this stuff. And it's going to be born out of a lot of frustration and anger, I think. And it would take a supremely gifted politician to be able to harness that frustration and put it into policy without treading into the anger. And I think when I look at Pierre Poilievre in particular, I know what I know about him from having worked with him, and I see what I'm hearing from him now, and it doesn't quite line up. And I get that people change and that this might be the new version, but maybe it's hoping against hope that there's actually a serious policy agenda that's meant to address some of these feelings. And I think it's a very delicate line about what's stoking, because I think a lot of these people that are angry have felt ignored. And so how do you acknowledge them without endorsing them? And that was like the trucker convoy protest for me, is that I think it was symptoms and disease again. I think people just pick 1 or 2 or 3 or 10 or 20. Sorry.
They don't want to be acknowledged or listened to. They want to win. They want their point of view to prevail. I just want to take you on for just a second, Andrew, because I am a big believer in the point you're making about the economy and about how people have been left out of the economy and about how 30, 40 years of neoliberalism have really, I think, been a big part of this. I take your point wholly, but I don't think you can overlook the identity side of this. And I mean, I think politics is more serious for people than it used to be, more personal for people than it used to be, more wrapped up in their own identity than it used to be. And when I see that guy going after Chrystia Freeland, I don't believe it's that he's angry over fertilizer policy or over inflation policy. I think he's angry because she's in charge and she's not like him. And he wants somebody like him in charge, hopefully him. I think a lot of this is identity stuff.
I don't know if it's that simple, though. I think what we also now have for maybe the last 10, 15 years, and certainly Trudeau's emblematic of this, is this idea that we are now being all reduced back into our racial or sexual characteristics, and that your standing in society depends on what traits you have. And I accept the point that it's been a one-way conversation in places like Canada for a long time, but it's a hard transition to manage not devaluing somebody's point of view because, say, I happen to be a middle-aged heterosexual white man. Like, why can't I have an opinion about stuff that I think impacts the country? And I think a lot of people look at politics, and it used to be a very class-based discussion of the left was for the working man and the right was for the big corporations or big business. And now it's more the left is for certain identity groups and the right is about maybe the ones of those that are left out. And what we're not talking about is actually what's going on in the country and why people feel at threat. And again, you can go through all the social studies you want. Racial tensions, group tensions get worse. The more inequality there is, the more stress there is in society, there is less social solidarity. I mean, we know these things. And I think sometimes we forget that countries like Canada have gone so far, we've pushed the boat so far out on the multicultural country. And that's a wonderful thing. But I think we've downplayed the tensions because we've had it so good for so long. And now what we're seeing
we really pretend there aren't any, right, Andrew? We really pretend there aren't any tensions associated with it.
Yeah, and there are. And I think there's an intelligent way to discuss that. And it's not, shut up, you racist. Stop talking about this stuff. And I think we've been a bit too quick to get to that point and not accommodating enough of going, like, I get that you're worried about this. I get that this is a thing that keeps you up at night. The answer is not to yell at women or minorities. It's to understand again, and I feel like this should go back to the kind of classic liberalism, the view that we are all individuals with rights and responsibilities and opportunities, and it shouldn't matter what you look like, what you sound like. I get that that's never been achieved, but I think again we forget in the West that we have gone further and farther to achieving that than anyone else, and we don't give ourselves the credit for that. And while we're not giving ourselves the credit, we've also underplayed the potential downsides for people. And we have to find a way to include more people in the future, which is going to be cities, higher education. That opportunity is we're going to have to work harder to spread that to more places because we're in a global world now. Toronto doesn't compete with Montreal only. It competes with London. It competes with New York. And if you're born in rural Canada, you're probably going to have to make a move. And that, again, when you get to questions of identity and culture and comfort and what looks like me and sounds like me, we're human beings. Of course, we like to think that we belong somewhere. And anytime people feel that is under threat, I think they get angry. And what we've seen, unfortunately, is people on the left willing to put their finger in that wound because it works for them electorally. And the right now going I'm not going to try to downplay this. I'm just going to row into it. And what Pierre is doing is just not giving a shit that people are coming at him for this. Because I think he thinks it helps him because the more the left and the media talk about this, the less they're talking about the issues that actually keep Canadians up at night. And only he is. So he gets to own that conversation.
Sneaking into your article there. Scott, before we get into Poilievre, you got anything to say about this?
Yeah, I think I want to go back to an earlier point about creating fertile ground for this, because I think something as complicated is always complicated. So it's not as static as, people are angry, and then you got politicians who are willing to exploit it, maybe to a degree to which they didn't in the past. I know I made that point, but it's not just that. I've also made the point in the past that, one of the challenges is that, the government hasn't provided a good enough response from a policy and political argument. So, I sort of look at it, the theme of you're getting left behind has been potent in politics forever, right? And that's what Poilievre, that's what the right, that's what Brexit, that's, a lot of the sort of contemporary right-wing populism, grievance populism is based on, right? You're getting screwed, you're getting left behind. There's an identity element to that, a large identity element to it, which is often unstated but implicit, which is why you don't see denunciations from some leaders, because they don't want to actually alienate that base or they don't want to endorse it. But there's other elements too. There's this economic element. And I just think, if you look at the example of FDR, right, without maybe the identity question, obviously, he had to deal with these things, right? He had Lindbergh on his ass, saying, listen, actually, we need strongman politics. We need to have a more central, we need to follow the European example of, a strong, pick yourself up by the bootstraps kind of mentality. And, it was veering toward fascism, his offering. But, FDR was able to navigate that stuff because, one, he started his sentences the same way the critics were, right? He started it by saying, you're getting left behind, right? He was saying to people, you're getting fucked. But then he had an answer and he said, but here's how we're going to actually fix that. And I think the challenge right now is that, we've had 40 years of economic orthodoxy, that globalization, neoliberalism was going to fix all things. It didn't. It worked to the overwhelming benefit of a few, not the many. And I think, you've got to see the federal government, I think now has to say, what, people are angry and they are angry for a reason. But here's what we're going to do about it. The response to it is to take the frustration, reflect people's frustrations, and direct it into a place of remedy, as opposed to pick up your torch and pick up your hammer.
I think this is more difficult, though, than you two are suggesting, because there may be a new economic paradigm coming, but it isn't here. Yeah. And the economy does what it does, yields the results that it does.
Yeah, and I think that's the missing point, is that national politics is buffeted by global issues, and that disconnect makes people feel impotent, even at the political level. Is that, what can I do in the face of global forces? And now if you look at some of the corporations, your Amazons, your Googles, these are behemoths that have bigger GDPs than a lot of countries. These are people that go into whatever country they need a result in and pay people like me to kind of help them get a result. And most people, again, ordinary, taking it back to them, they don't have that influence. They pick up the phone to their MP and their MP kind of does this because the stuff that they used to be able to sort was national. Margaret Thatcher had a problem with the kind of, sclerotic economy that was being controlled by the unions. She could break the unions and deregulate and kick off the big boom in the city of London and turn the country into a service economy. Now that that's happened, and now that we're in a global playground, it's really going to take global cooperation to fix that. And so that's why when you hear people like Pierre Poilievre now talking about the World Economic Forum like it's some conspiracy, look, they represent the kind of 40-year one-way view that we've had, but it doesn't mean global cooperation is wrong in trying to identify the issues and trying to get a fix, like tax leakage, tax havens, all that money that is stuffed away, changing things like, should businesses still work to the shareholder profit model of stuff, or should they go back to something a little bit more dated from that great period of economic leveling after the Second World War? These are the conversations we should be having and internationally, to see if we can smash some of this money out of places like the Virgin Islands and put it back into Main Street, Ontario or Alberta. And there's such an opportunity to pick up on that point. If the left could just get back to economics and the little person being screwed, the world would be their oyster, and get out of this world of, if you look like this, you can say this. If you look like that, you can have that. And I think that would be a less resentful, more constructive, and ultimately electorally productive way to channel this discussion, instead of condemning blanket clans like you're all racists for this, or if you support that, you must be a bad person. Maybe we're bad people because we feel stressed and we act in bad ways. It doesn't mean that fundamentally something's broken. And I wish there was more charity on the left when they looked at the right and tried to address these concerns, instead of always kind of punching the bruise or sticking their finger in the wound.
I just, sorry, last word, but I promise I won't drone on and on. But the best thing you can do is beat it, right? Like ultimately, because that which wins gets repeated and gets copied. And the best thing you can do right now is beat it. Beat Poilievre, beat this. That's the most cogent, coherent, manifest example of this kind of politics that we have in this jurisdiction. So you got to beat it. Because if it wins, then the lesson that people will draw is this is what you have to do, and this is how you win, and there will be more of it. So step number one is beating it. Step number two, therefore, is figuring out how to beat it. And the only thing I would say in response to what you're saying, Andrew, because obviously I believe strongly, I subscribe to this idea that the other side has to come up with an economic alternative that responds to the anxieties that people have. Get back to 2015, you're talking about how do we build a better middle class that's bigger and stronger, and pick up some of the anxiety that people have. I understand that. But when you add, and get away from all these identity issues, I'm very conscious that we're three white guys in our 50s who were saying, let's get away from all that. This is the better way to go. Because people are going to say, right, okay.
And people, 60.
Right. Okay. So I'm a white guy in my 50s. There's one white guy in his 50s here. I just think people are going to go, well, that's fucking easy for you to say, and that's convenient for you to say, and you find the alternative uncomfortable. But it's also part of the discussion whether you like it or not, because it's part of the anger. There is, as David says, a big element of the anger isn't because people are like, well, you know what? I wish there was a different minimum wage policy. It's, I don't like that.
The guy probably drove to that city hall in a Ford F-150.
Yeah. Like it's not, our politics aren't rational, right? Our politics are driven by emotion and fear and all of that. And I just think, the government's going to have to do both things. It's going to have to acknowledge and reflect the values of inclusivity and diversity, but it can't just rest on that. It's got to have the other. It's got to have a potent alternative to it. And if people don't hear that, then I fear that it's not impossible that Poilievre will win. To me, that's the only thing that keeps me up day and night. I think that this kind of politics could triumph. And if it triumphs, then we're stuck with it.
Yeah, but
okay, let's go. Let's wait a second. We got to go to Poilievre. Okay, sorry, Andrew. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just have one quick point. But just to Scott's point, like we're all white at the same kind of age. But, like the mother of my children is Egyptian, and my two young girls are half Egyptian, half Arab. So it's not that because I'm a white man at 47 years old, I don't think about these things. And I think that's where we're just, again, being, to Scott's earlier point, the world is complicated and that makes it harder to fix. And I don't think we get anywhere just blanketing people as you must think this way because of that. My life experience, like, yes, I am who I am, but you don't know about my life. You don't know about what I've been through and how I see the world. So it's a little bit more sophisticated than that.
Fair enough. My kids have red hair and look like characters from a Rudyard Kipling book.
Say you can't imagine the paleness at Reid's house. It's amazing.
It's just a big sea of salt.
So here's a number, 27 million tons. In the months ahead, CN expects to move up to 27 million tons of grain from the prairies to markets in Canada and the US and to seaports for shipment abroad. It's a big, crucial job. You simply cannot overstate the importance of grain to the Canadian economy, and getting the crop to market smoothly and safely requires a supply chain in which all the moving parts work efficiently and in harmony. Actually, all signs are that the coming season will be a welcome return to normal. Grain producers are expecting an average crop this year, which is an excellent prospect after last year's devastating drought. Actually, last year was an experience no one wants to repeat. A summer of extreme heat and forest fires was followed by an autumn of heavy flooding, and one of the harshest winters in memory. And of course, COVID disrupted workforces across the country. It was as though the forces of nature were conspiring. In any case, the new season is on us, and CN is prepared. The railway has been hiring and training a new generation of railroaders. And in the past few weeks, I've talked here about the billions of dollars it's invested in locomotives, new rail cars, and improvements to its thousands of miles of tracks, tunnels, crossings, and bridges. The railway reckons it'll be able to move up to 744,000 tons of grain a week this year. And the 27 million tons figure is just a forecast. If the crop is bigger than expected and the grain needs moving, CN will move it. Clearly, the world economy is recovering. Demand for commodities is strong. CN has seen that reflected in its traffic volumes. Normal is good. Bring it on. CN looks forward to helping Canada's grain farmers succeed in 2022. So, Poilievre. Okay. So let's try to dissect this rationally from a campaign strategy point of view. They took a lot of time to think about it, and they had some time to think about it. Every other conservative politician pretty much in Canada responded in the way they were expected to respond. They made some sort of statement in which they did no whataboutism, they did no justification, they did no, hey, it happened to me too. They just said, this is terrible, this is appalling, this shouldn't happen. Poilievre takes a very long time to say anything at all, and it becomes questionable whether he will say anything, because he has really taken a strategy of not responding to these kinds of things, which your column is about, Andrew. Eventually does an interview with somebody, which is, if you were looking for a reaction to the Freeland thing, was pretty unsatisfying in the sense that he sort of dealt with it in 2 seconds off the top as being unfortunate, and then started to talk about himself and his own issues on the road. So what is the thinking behind Poilievre's response? Why would they not just knock this off the table and right off the bat make everybody happy and say, this guy's terrible, that was a terrible thing?
Yeah, I think it's as you'll know well, once you set your identity and campaign as a certain thing, the second you're not that thing, people notice it. And you risk upsetting the people that like you because you're that thing, for no benefit on the other side. He's not going to get credit. It's not like anybody who doesn't like Pierre Poilievre is going to go, well, that was a mature response if he just comes out and does that. So you kind of go, I got to find a way to thread that needle and be who I am, but be seen to be doing the decent thing. And then, what he's done is chucked off another conversation off the back of that on the fairness question of why is it that only I get asked these things? Why is it that nobody else gets to answer for everybody on their side of the spectrum? He wants us to go down that rabbit hole. So I think that was deliberate from that. The point about his family getting abused, I've been trying to think if I've ever seen anything about his wife getting abused written up in the press, and probably not. And should it be? I don't know. But I think that was the tactic, was I can't alienate the people who love me for not giving a shit about what those lily liberals say about me in the press. But he realized that it was serious enough that he had to condemn it whilst trying to spark off another conversation about fairness. And is this right that one side of the spectrum has to answer for everybody on their side?
I think a couple things. I think, first of all, they're not that bothered by it. I think you just have to, you have to make that assumption. Not that bothered by it. So if you're not that bothered by it, then the only lens through which you view it is, how does it affect me and my campaign, and how does my response affect me and my campaign and my political futures? And then I think, because if you're really bothered by it, you find the nearest microphone and you go, Jesus Christ, you grab the microphone out of the lady's hand like John McCain did and said, sorry, I'm sorry, ma'am, right? But Senator Obama is a good and decent person, and he's not a Muslim, right? So if you're not that bothered by it, then you just, then you think about it strictly in terms of your own political calculation and circumstance. And we can condemn that and we can howl about that, but I think that that's just an obvious starting point, right? They're not that upset about it. They rate it as less significant. I think they probably genuinely sort of go, you know what, this shit happens all the time. It happens to everybody, blah, blah, blah. It's why they go to whataboutisms. In part it's a tactic, but in part I think it's also their belief. Is that a blind spot? I don't know. But once you get into their political, yes, I do think it's a blind spot. But in terms of the political calculus, I think a couple things. One, then you go to, well, how do I need to pivot? Do I need to moderate? Do I need to make some sort of shift at some point from the hardcore red meat campaign that I've had so far to something else? And I think, one, they're guided by the last war. And the last war, conservative leaders who tried to moderate themselves and then looked like they had no identity because they were eschewing. They sold themselves as one thing, then they tried to pivot. And I think they're heavily influenced by that. They were critical of that. We know Jenny was hypercritical of that. And I think they're committed to not being that. And I think that's both by a matter of strategy and a matter of instinct on their part. I think it's a matter of what they sincerely believe good politics is. I think the other thing is they think, well, we need to mitigate our vulnerability. But how do they mitigate their vulnerability? By shifting the focus to a different arena of discussion. So he had a video out yesterday with a woman who makes Nanaimo bars, bakery, the impacts of inflation, not just.
How did you say that? How did you? Are you even a Canadian? How did you say that word?
Nanaimo.
All right, I think.
All right, Nanaimo bar. So and she's like, and he's smiling, he's chatting with her, he's talking about the costs of the ingredients and how they've gone up. He's obviously doing the political thing and attaching all that to the greatest degree possible to Justin Trudeau. But he's having a convivial conversation with an appealing person who's in a difficult situation. He's using it. I think that's what they think their correction is. So if you look at it through the political lens, I think they say, okay, do we have a vulnerability? Yeah. How are we going to address that vulnerability? We're going to talk less about mandates as time goes on, and we're going to talk more about economic dislocation. And by the way, if we can deliver that with a smile, not just a snarl, that's probably going to serve us better. I thought that was a really potent piece of political communication that they put out yesterday. A little bit qualitatively different than what they've done in the past. Not just the anger march, but had a sort of qualitatively different feel. And I think that's the way they look at it. I think. So
you're saying for all the people who was thinking maybe he's an asshole because he didn't respond appropriately to Freeland. No, he's not an asshole. He's having fun with this lady talking about Nanaimo bars.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that he is saying that this is not the place that he wishes to signal the pivot that he wants to make. The pivot he's going to make is away from some of those other issues toward this issue where he thinks there's a broad coalition of voters. And I just think, I think they genuinely think like we're not going to demonstrate that we're pivoting, that we're moderating, that we're putting water in our wine on this issue set. Because they don't think it's as big a deal. They don't think it works for them. They'd rather do it by moving from mandates to cost of living. And I think that's the way they're looking at it. Because, as I say, it all starts with, if you're not really that bothered by it, then you only look at it in terms of, well, what works strictly for my campaign.
There's a lot of whataboutism on social media about this. And in particular, a lot of the whataboutism is from conservatives who are saying, well, why is everybody, and especially the media, pounding away on this issue and demanding that conservatives apologize and grovel over somebody who probably votes for them doing this to Chrystia Freeland, and the government's getting a free ride for having hired an anti-Semite on contract to teach anti-racism to networks. Is that a reasonable counterclaim, Andrew? Is there media bias in the way these things are covered?
I think if you were to poll the media and what keeps them up at night more, it would be the kind of people that are costing Chrystia Freeland than any guy that's hired to write an anti-racism campaign that is himself a racist. I think that naturally their focus is more on that side. And so they don't cover it with the same enthusiasm because they take more offense from that. And there's a separate question here about, anti-Semitism and does it rate the same as other racisms? And there's a great British comedian author here named David Baddiel who wrote a book called Jews Don't Count that makes this point. He's a left-wing Jew, and he's like, I can't get progressives to condemn anti-Semitism. So I think that's an issue that should be discussed. And why is it Jewish MPs that are left doing the work of condemning this? And then there's the governance scandal. They knew this guy was who he was before he was appointed. But it's been covered. It's not like it's ducked completely under the radar. Is it getting as much coverage? No. And I think that's because media don't like the issue. They care more about right-wing. I
saw Trudeau do a media appearance on the weekend, Andrew. He did not get asked about it.
Yeah, no, look, and he went overseas on a big tour once when he was in the middle of the shit. And the first press conference and 9 questions, and not one of them asked about the issue of the day. And again, I think that's like, I don't think individual reporters get up in the morning and say, I'm going to cover this way and not that this way. I just think they come from a worldview and a life experience that makes them more favorable to the kind of view of Justin Trudeau than it would of Pierre Poilievre or the people he's trying to court. And I think media needs to check itself and remember that there are people across the country who don't work in newsrooms in the middle of downtown cities and have different concerns. And a lot of the media that used to serve the communities that Poilievre's courting now are dead and dying or gone. And they don't see themselves reflected in the national conversation as much. And, will we still have in a generation working class reporters? A guy like Bob Fife, who comes from small town Northern Ontario, who didn't train as a trade to do this, but it's like had his phenomenal career in journalism. Are those days gone? In a place like London, to start at a paper, you basically have to have rich parents who can fund your internship while you do this, right? And I think that the inputs into journalism now, and if you go into a lot of newsrooms, the fact that this guy's hired to train broadcasters on what racism, it kind of gives up the game, right? It's like they're panicked about knowing that they're not, reflecting the current orthodoxy on who has standing and who gets to speak. So they get these charlatans in there, whether it's this guy or D'Angelo to do a white fragility song and dance. And they tick a box and they go, look, we're good people. When we should look at things as, is it right or is it wrong? Yes, it's wrong that this guy was hired to do anti-racism wrong. Yes, it's wrong that this Yahoo went in and accosted a politician, And I think just take it as it comes on the issue and on the principle and not about who's doing it to whom. If one side's doing it to the other and it's wrong, then the other side does it the other way. And I think we need to get that consistency going again in how we look at these issues. And then it doesn't become a question of volume on one side or the other. It's how we address the principle here. But maybe that's just me being a fantasist to think that this kind of thing can happen anymore.
All right. We got 5 minutes.
Can I say something? I just want to say something real quick on that, because I don't agree. I don't agree with this whole thing. I don't think this. I don't agree. This issue got covered. Other stuff will get covered. It should get covered. I don't mean that to be glib in any way, shape, or form. But if you're going to ask me what's the biggest problem right now in newsrooms, the biggest problem right now in newsrooms for the past decade is that newsrooms are forced to struggle constantly with how much false equivalency they should create in their reporting in order to insulate themselves from the nonstop onslaught that their editors get and their senior producers get and their senior management get from the ranks of the angry. So, you find that newsrooms are almost paralyzed in the reporting of a bunch of these issues for fear that, they're calling the Freedom Convoy guys a bunch of bullshitters. Oh no, we have to put both sides on. I think that's a bigger issue. I think the truth of the matter is the past decade, and intensified since, say, 2016 with Trump, media, the fundamental test that media is failing isn't the one that we're talking about. I think it's that they're struggling too hard to do both sidesism in so much of the reporting. And I think that we lose a sense of accurate proportionality that's happening as, a bunch of right-wing politicians, exploit and mobilize this anger, all this ugliness. And I think that's a bigger challenge in newsrooms, to be blunt.
All right. Interesting. Andrew, we've gone on so long, we actually don't have time to discuss your clipping.
We kind of did anyway.
Worked. Let me urge everybody to go to the Ottawa Citizen from, I think, 2 or 3 days ago and read Andrew's column where he basically says that Poilievre is laying a big trap for the Liberals by getting them to fight in a way that Trump did, getting them to fight on a bunch of things that are outrageous but not important. And that in the meantime, he's talking about things that are important to people, and he's going to win the framing fight. It's a super interesting column, a super interesting perspective, and it kind of goes against what Scott and I have been talking about a little bit. So it would have been an interesting conversation, and maybe someday we'll have it in the future. But this was, I think, a hell of an interesting conversation. So thank the two of you for working your way through what is, I think, a difficult subject matter to discuss a little bit. So it's time for our Hey Yous. Gordon, can you round up the crowd, see if we've lost everybody, bring them back?
Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats. The Hey Yous are about to begin.
All right, who's got a Hey You?
Come on, across the pond.
I gotta hate you. Yeah, like my hey yous to Bell Media PR. And it's like, could you stop punching yourselves in the face? Please, you're an important institution and people are losing faith. We are now a couple of weeks on from the surprise firing of Lisa Laflamme, and you still have not told us why she was fired. You talk endlessly about why she wasn't fired. It wasn't about gray hair. It wasn't about misogyny. So put the actual reason out there. If Lisa Laflamme was fired because she literally wouldn't get with the new program, then say so. It's better than the shit kicking you're taking now. Thank you very much.
Excellent. I hear you. Scott?
My hey you is, I touched on earlier, my hey you is to the powers that be around the Prime Minister and the Liberal team, federal Liberal team. I mentioned Pierre Poilievre's new video from yesterday, and I get made fun of constantly by people because I'm saying, look at this content. This content is cogent. This content cuts. Pay attention to it. Well, I really hope that in the flurry of everything that's happened this week, attacks on journalists, attacks on politicians, all this ugliness, I hope that the Prime Minister's team is paying attention to the video that was released yesterday. He is telegraphing how he's going to campaign and how he's going to campaign better. And it's going to be with a smile, not a snarl, as I said. It's going to be a laser focus on cost of living. It will be short on remedies, but he doesn't really think, and he's probably right, that he doesn't need to offer up a ton of remedies. He just needs to be able to capture the sense of frustration that people have while moderating some of the angry edge of that. And I think that video is something that the Liberals need to take really seriously, look at it, say, this is the game plan, and therefore this is what we need to workshop around. What is the proper policy response? What's the proper political response? What's the proper communications response? And it builds on my ongoing frustration that they have not provided a cogent, coherent, consistent response to Pierre Poilievre, and it's got to start now. The guy's going to be the leader in 10 days. Start with this video. Get your shit together.
You know, just like Trudeau isn't as hated as conservatives wish he was or think he is, Poilievre's not as unlikable as Liberals think he is. And that video was pretty clear evidence of that. My hey you goes out to Ahmad Hussein, the Minister of Diversity and Inclusion. Man, I wish you were not this week's poster child for lack of accountability, but you are. I mean, it is the dissonance between watching a government that is prepared to apologize for literally any error or indiscretion ever made by anybody else and refuses to acknowledge any on its own is just becoming really jarring. And this was a clear error, and somebody made it. So would somebody please take some accountability? And it really starts with you. And if it wasn't you, let's see a head roll. Because it was a serious error, and it was offensive. And so far, it appears to be a decision made by nobody anywhere with no consequences. And that's bullshit. Curse of politics. So thank you, TELUS, our presenting sponsor, and CN, our sponsor. Thank you to everybody for listening and watching today. Yes, you can watch this on YouTube. Please go to Apple or Spotify or YouTube or wherever, make a comment about our show and a rating. And thank you, Scott, for being here as always. And Andrew, thanks for managing time zones and joining us from across the pond. And don't burn your furniture this winter.
Stock up on butter now. Stock up on butter now before they start issuing ration stamps.
All right, we'll see you next week for more Curse of Politics.